All right, g'day everyone, bienvenue, and welcome to the Energeia podcast. Dr. G with you again, and today I'll be speaking with Kylie Rochford. Kylie is an assistant professor of organizational behavior at the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, Utah. Her research primarily focuses on the topics of workplace relationships and interpersonal dynamics, and she has also published in the areas of organizational neuroscience, emotional and social intelligence, and organizational citizenship, and was responsible for designing and operationalizing a psychometric measure of relational climate in organizations. Kylie has been published in a number of top academic business and cognitive science journals, including the Academy of Management Review, the Journal of Business Ethics, Organizational Research Methods, Human Resource Management Review, Group and Organization Management, Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, and Frontiers in Psychology. She is also a certified executive coach and a research fellow at the Coaching Research Lab at Case Western Reserve University, and has worked with organizations including the US Forest Service, the Ford Motor Company, and the New South Wales District Health Board, and is a member of the Academy of Management and the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. And prior to her career in academia, Kylie was an elite athlete who represented New Zealand in karate and who competed in age group triathlon and road cycling, as well as working as a ski instructor through New Zealand, Australia, the United States, and Japan. Kylie, haere mai, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Gareth. I think that's the longest intro I've ever received.
Oh, well, I was actually thinking just given all the work that you've been up to, it might have been too potted and too summary, so I'm glad it was suitably long enough. So you and I collectively have this peculiar distinction of having been two Kiwis in the same department at grad school in the frozen climes of the American Midwest, which is a conversation in its own right, and there's so much of your other work and our other shared interests that we could dissect today, but instead, today, we're going to focus relatively narrowly, however deeply, on two related open questions. To what extent should organizations be held responsible for the well-being of their employees, and what are the possible positive and negative implications of organizations taking responsibility for this aspect of their employees' lives? Now, I've personally spent a lot of time thinking about these questions. It's framed a lot of my guiding philosophies and practices as a coaching practitioner and as an organizational consultant. Starting next week, I'm actually going to be going on the road delivering a bunch of seminars and workshops entitled Healthier Humans, Happier People, Higher Performing Leaders, for which organizational support and responsibility for employee well-being is one of the major themes I'm going to be talking about, particularly as it compares to individual responsibility for one's own well-being, and ultimately where the optimal balance between these two sources of responsibility lies. And yet, as much as I think about these ideas, and as much as they inform the work that I do, I still don't feel like I've quite fully locked in where my own intuitions lie here. And even though I like to think I still place a greater premium and a greater emphasis on individual level responsibility, I also recognize more and more these days that even an earnest approach to individual level responsibility for one's own well-being can be incredibly constrained, if not outright compromised, by a myriad of organizational factors and influences, many of which we'll no doubt get into today. So maybe just as a way of calibrating us at ground zero and kind of directing the scent with which we follow our noses today, could you please just give us your own current, perhaps high-level intuitions about those same two questions, where you're coming from right now, what your current feelings are right now about the two questions: to what extent should organizations be held responsible for the well-being of their employees, and what are the possible positive and negative implications of organizations taking responsibility for this aspect of their employees' lives?
Absolutely. So like you, Gareth, I'm still calibrating my own position on this. And I think you hit it really well, saying, this is a both and. This is not ever going to be one person's responsibility as an individual or solely on the organization. Ultimately, the human race, we need both. We need to work together to ensure that humans are sustainable, and without us both working together, I don't see that happening. So here's where I'm at with it. I think organizations should be held responsible for employee well-being to a degree. Well-being is protected or is in the Declaration for Human Rights. I actually wrote down a couple because I'm not sure how many people know this, but I went looking when I started researching workplace dignity. And so I went looking to see, is a dignified workplace one of our human rights? So I found two things that I thought were really interesting. So in Article 23, it says equal pay for equal work. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, and how we define equal. And particularly, how much value do we place on human health? What would be equal pay for you to, I don't know, walk away with heart disease or chronic stress? Like, how much pay do we need to make that equal? The second one was just and favorable work conditions. The current statistics suggest we're not doing so well in this respect. There's a lot of burnt out employees, worker suicide is on the rise. Even the COVID pandemic, where people were forced to work and put their health on the line in order to keep businesses running. So it's pretty debatable how we're doing on providing just and favorable conditions of work. And I'm talking just to the US, and I know in other countries we are far, far from that benchmark. And then finally, in Article 23, it talks about just and favorable remuneration, ensuring the existence of worth for human dignity. And I think, again, over the last few years, it's really been put in our face that basic human dignity is up for grabs when it comes to a trade-off between work and your basic human rights. So really well-known companies have seen, basic needs of employees, like needing to use a bathroom, are not being provided to them. And I don't think these are one-off circumstances. And then finally, in Article 24, it says everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays with pay. And again, I think, how are we doing here? What is the average work week? What is reasonable? How do we even define that? And these are all things which I think are coming to a head right now. We're seeing movement in the workforce. We've had this great resignation. We're still having it. People are pushing back. And I think organizations are trying to respond. But it's a very complex issue. And I think it's a big challenge for organizations to work out, what do we do, right? Where do we start with this great issue of well-being? How do we approach it? And a lot of the research that I've been doing, it's with the best of intentions. A lot of these organizations are trying to take some responsibility for their employee well-being. And there's a lot of tensions in how that's being received and experienced by the employees themselves.
Right. And I guess my concern, I think where I ultimately come back to is even perfect worlding this a little bit. If we really did have a major paradigm shift within organizations, and we really had not just a revolution in terms of organizations getting more on board with the idea that they are responsible in some sense for organizational well-being, but they actually have the direction and the insight to do it properly. My concern is, even if all of that were true, there would still be factors outside of the workplace, influential enough factors, individual lifestyle level factors, that ultimately would undo a lot of that good work. I think that some of the more obvious ones the workplace could be right. I mean, something like a bathroom, for example, like that's just, if we're still at that point, if we're still at the point where we can't even provide someone, a place to go to the loo, a dignified, respectable place to go to the loo on site, then really we do still have a massive amount of work ahead of us. And to the degree that that's kind of a more common scenario than I perhaps was aware of, then that's truly tragic and shocking and unfortunate. But I think if you set aside what to me seem like those more sort of obvious cases, when you talk about things like responsibility for individual mental health, something a little bit more nebulous, a little bit more wide or whatever, my worry, I guess, is that with all the best intentions and all the best informedness and all the willingness to offer the right initiatives on the part of organizations, there's still going to be enough people in the wider population not doing things at an individual or lifestyle level such that all those good initiatives are ultimately negated or offset, or their most appreciable benefits are offset. So I'm wondering what you kind of think of that. Like, is it a case where even if the organizations themselves fine-tune the dials to the right way, are we still going to be left in the situation where individual level factors compromise those possibly positive outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a chicken egg situation. And on the one hand, if organizations do everything right, individuals can still do everything wrong. On the other hand, individuals can't do everything right if organizations don't change or do something to create the conditions under which that's possible. And I don't know how much scientific truth there is to the 80-20 rule, but I feel like there's always going to be that 10% down the low end that are going to be unhealthy and not look after their well-being regardless of the conditions, and then there's that 10% at the other end who, despite the conditions, will prioritize their well-being. And then in the middle, you have this large number of people who have good intentions, but, and it's not only work. I mean, there's a lot of lifestyle factors that come into it, but a big one of those things is work. We spend a lot of our day at work. I'm definitely one of those people. I would love to exercise more. I try to put it on my calendar, but, so often the work has to get done. So it's, when do you find the time to go and do that? So I think it's good. It needs both, right? Like, I need to take responsibility for, getting myself organized to go and be healthy and pack myself a healthy lunch, etc. But I also need time to be able to do that stuff. And I need organization to allow me that flexibility and time to enact some of those healthy habits. And also the other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking is definitely in some of the research that we're doing at the moment, we're finding from an organization's perspective, they're trying to provide, a lot of organizations right now are really trying hard to provide a lot of resources to employees, like the mental health thing, for instance. And I think that something that would be helpful for organizations is to really think carefully, if things are not being used, why? Like, why aren't people using them? Because what we're hearing is, if you're working an 80-hour week, when are you going to go to your therapy session, right? Like where does that fit in your 80-hour week? And that takes an hour out. So when are you going to get that work done that was meant to be done in that hour that you were out at therapy? So a lot of people are telling us, we know they're trying, but when I need to use the times that I most need these things, the times that I really need the meditation or the yoga or whatever it is that they're offering, I can't utilize them. I don't have the time. My manager is breathing down my back, or whatever the situation is. So I think, this is a real struggle for organizations. It's not as simple as just throwing a bunch of resources out there and hoping, with an opt-in system that people are going to utilize them. It also requires some individual responsibility, but also structural changes that allow those things to be utilized.
Right. And I mean, like, to use the narrow example of like a therapy session or something like that, some companies it'll be like providing a gym membership, and there'll be the same conundrum, right? Like, they provided employees a gym membership, but where do I get the hour or 30 minutes a day I should be going to the gym or whatever, right? So again, just to thought experiment this a little bit, let's assume that Acme organization A arrives at a situation where they're like, you know what? There's no point in us offering these wellness initiatives unless there's a practicable and time-bound way of our employees actually being able to take us up on what we're offering them. So let's say that they are able to conjure up the time somehow, I don't know, restructure their policies or restructure their work week, whatever it might be. The employees then have the time to do it. Is it reasonable in that situation on the part of the employers, on the part of the organizations, to then say, we've provided you with the time to do it, now we have a firm expectation, an unwavering expectation perhaps, that you will do it? Right, so for the employee who now all of a sudden has that hour a day to go to the gym, or has that extra hour a week to go to the therapy session, if they don't do it, what should the response of the organization be? Should they be reasonably able to hold that employees, not hold their feet to the fire, but have a reasonable pushback and say, hey, we're offering something good here that's developmental for you and will ultimately be developmental for your career here. We've provided you with the opportunity to take advantage of it. We damn well expect you to use it. Where do your intuitions lie there?
So I won't go with my intuitions. I'll go with what I'm doing a lot of research in this area right now. So what the data is saying right now is, and this was, so when I was thinking about this conversation, I noted two issues about the sort of smorgasbord approach where you offer, one of them was people can't use them, right? They can't have time. The other one was that employees experience these efforts very differently. So one way of interpreting these efforts is my organization cares about me, they care about my health and well-being, and they've done all these good things, and that's why they're making me do this. An alternative interpretation that's coming through is my organization is trying to control me. They're overstepping their bounds. My health is my private business. It's got nothing to do with my organization. My contract with the organization is to provide X service, and they don't get to tell me how many times to go to the doctor or that I must go to the gym. So, again, like, how people are experiencing these efforts is very different. And so do I think organizations should be able to force people? My feeling is no, unless there's very clear effort. So for instance, in the case of an athlete, right, where their physical conditioning is central to the work they perform, then I think that a case could be made for requiring that. I don't see that happening with a lot of the other work that we do. And I could also respect that, people don't want every aspect of their life being consumed by what they feel is organizational control. So for some people, the preference is give me time and let me use my time to deal with well-being in a way that works for me. That might be going for the gym, that might be just family time, it might be sleeping, whatever it is. That's something that I need to figure out. I just need you to create the time. And maybe you want to give resources or maybe you don't, right? But for other people, they want to use a gym at the organization and they want to use childcare at the organization or whatever else is being offered. So I think each person's going to have a different reaction to that.
Right. And I mean, I would certainly never advocate forcing or even, even sort of like cajoling or coercing someone into that kind of position. But, you mentioned the example of the professional athlete. And this is an obvious example where the employer should have a reasonable expectation that you have to meet a threshold of physical conditioning, right? But given what we now know these days about the relationship between physical health and mental health and the relationship between emotional stability and leadership, and also the relationship between leadership and emotional contagion, like I'm sort of spelling out a very kind of indirect causal path here, but I think for leaders, given that leaders in particular have this outsized influence via this mechanism of emotional contagion on the emotional well-being of their followers in particular. Like, emotional contagion's real, but it's more real when the effects come from leader to follower, or so the research that I've read suggests. So in that situation, a leader kind of has I would argue, not just a responsibility, but kind of an ethical duty of care, given the influence they have on the emotional stability and the moods of others, to take care of their own emotional health. Now, the single biggest predictor that I've seen of emotional health is physical health, right? If you take care of your physical body, and there's you mentioned the smorgasbord, there's a cornucopia of different ways you can take care of your physical health. And it shouldn't just be as simple as, well, you're a leader, you're in this position of responsibility, I damn well expect you to go to the gym every day. I'm not saying it should be as simple as that. But there should be, or I wonder if there needs to be something of a rerouting of the organizational expectations in that kind of direction. Nothing about we're going to force you, or we want to have this like outsized amount of control over your lives, but that philosophically, as an organization, we expect our employees in general, but we expect our leaders in particular, given what we know about the research on emotions and emotional contagion and so forth, to be in as clear and emotionally stable a state of mind as they can possibly muster. And that part of that expectation means that, we're not only going to give you the resources you need, that combinatorially you can put together this healthy state of mind, we actually expect you to use them. And, perhaps that's a conversation, you kind of alluded to this before, but perhaps this is a conversation that you just have to be super clear about from the get-go, like in terms of expectations. Like, when you're sitting down to hire someone, for a senior leadership position, you just come out with it and say, hey, look, we've got these expectations around mental health and emotional stability as a leadership. We take these ideas very seriously. We believe the evidence is on our side for this, on this front, that some of the biggest contributing factors to that mental health and emotional stability are lifestyle oriented. So while we don't want to control your life, and we don't want to have this invasive level of influence over your life, we have what we believe to be a reasonable expectation around how you should live your life. So what do you think about, is that, because that to me is just that's not control. Okay, that's not saying we're gonna control you, but like say that the people who would respond to that with this kind of knee-jerk sense of, I feel like you're controlling my life or something like that, in the job interview, they're not obliged to take the job, right? They're not obliged to take the job in that situation. This organization has standards. You don't agree with those standards philosophically or morally. You feel like it's organizational control, or in this case, a potential employer's control over your life. So don't take the job. Go somewhere else where they have a more loosey-goosey approach on this. So I don't know. I've said a lot there. So at the risk of waffling here, I'll let you respond.
It sounds like you're joining some sort of religious cult, not an organization. So look, I hear what you're saying. I think you might find yourself in hot water with employment law with those sorts of stipulations, just because, it could easily be experienced as discrimination for someone who has a mental health issue. It could be experienced as, you'd have to be very broad stroke when you said physical health, because you can't obviously discriminate based on appearance. So if you have somebody who's overweight, like, that can't be a reason for you not to hire them. So I think you could get hot water there, but I want to put back something else for you. I just want to quickly come back to the point about the smorgasbord option. So something that you could do to get around the control issue, which some people respond very well to. I need someone to tell me what to do. Like, I am at that point. So I have a coach who rings me every 2 weeks and says, did you do what you were meant to do? So you could offer a personal trainer. So for those employees who wanted that level of make you do it, that way, again, like, those people who are going to respond to that can take advantage of it. Those who don't want to feel like to be told what to do, that's fine. The other thing I wanted to push back on here is, what is going on in the work environment that is causing so much emotional stress and so many mental health problems and pushing people to the point where, this has become such an issue? Because I mean, there's certainly some jobs where I can see that emotional toll is embedded in the work that they do. That's very high stakes. I get that. There's a lot of people whose jobs are ultimately not life and death scenarios. And yet we're still seeing, even in those jobs, a huge emotional toll and physical toll to the work that we're doing. So if we think about self-determination theory, that theory says that, human beings are, we want to function in an optimal way. That's what we're motivated to do under the right conditions, providing our needs are being met. So I'm wondering what needs are not being met in the work environment that is causing people to function in a suboptimal way. And maybe it would be easier for employees to think about how do we do better there, and then maybe we don't need as much focus on all of these other issues because our employees are intrinsically motivated and will take care of themselves. So I think that there is an assumption that, if the environment is perfect, right back to our very first point, right? Like, to what extent will people take personal responsibility? To what extent do people want to be optimal in how they function on a day-to-day basis? And what role is the environment playing here? So, in the case of a leader, managers and leaders, we know that's where the squeeze is. That's where the pressure is. Like, what can we do to help them? How can we change their jobs to make that squeeze a little bit less, so that they're not on the edge of a breakdown at any given moment? Well, they're not stress eating or whatever else it is that they're doing. So the question that I think organizations need to focus on right now is how can they redesign work so that wellness is maintained when people are working, rather than work depleting people and trying to fix them with some sort of wellness intervention. So how can we design work in a way where we don't deplete our well-being when we enact our jobs? Does it have to be depleting? Is there a way that we can work that means that we are healthy just in the way that we're living? This wellness intervention thing feels like the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, right? We'll fix people when they're broken. And I'm not sure if that's ultimate. I mean, that response will work probably for a while. I'm not sure it's an optimal solution. I think it's maybe satisfactory. It ticks the boxes. It makes people feel good about their organization, but we should be able to do our jobs without having physical repercussions and mental repercussions that require intervention. That's at least what I think.
Yeah, sure. And look, I think maybe just to go, this is something of a restating of what I sort of thought out loud earlier, but I mean, let's say that we have this like organization-wide mandate, this kind of brief around, okay, we have to completely redefine and reconceptualize and reoperationalize the nature of work such that it isn't, let's say that it's not as depleting as it currently is, because especially heavy lies the head that wears a crown, right? Especially at the higher tiers of leadership, work is still going to be challenging. Work is going to be stressful. And I mean, most senior leaders that I know, they kind of want it that way as well. They don't want their jobs to be, there's that literature about the inverted U curve, the optimal amount of stress. I know it's a little oversimplified, right? But I think anecdotally, certainly most senior leaders that I've worked with, they do like to have a little bit of stress in their jobs, right? They don't like to have this overpowering chronic stress of the kind that you're alluding to, which is just completely causing people and organizations to implode right now. But they do want, I think, a little bit of it. They want some amount of it. So let's say we get organizations into a position where work is challenging but not chronically, deleteriously stressful in the way that it currently is. Okay, then the focus has to be, how do we build individuals that are better able to cope with that stress? Right, now part of that I agree, comes from the organization itself. Part of it has to be the organization better setting the conditions on the ground for those employees to be in a more advantageous position to start thriving and start being fulfilled at work. But you've also got to do the work yourself. And this is where I come back to this idea of like, is there a reasonable expectation on the organization's part? You know, like, is there something to be said for this has to be kind of like, you know, if we're going to reconceptualize this idea of well-being at work and the organization's responsibility, should we be arriving at a point where there's kind of like a mutual contract or an affirmation in place? You know, we will do our part, but we damn well expect you to do your part as well. We will do our part to make the workplace less depleting and less stressful, but you have to, on your own time, take your own initiative and build a brain that is better capable of dealing with that stress and that energy depletion when it does come around. And it is going to come around. We might be able to mitigate its worst excesses. We might be able to tamp down where it kind of like runs off the rails a bit currently. But this is work. This is not fun time at the playground, right? There is going to be some amount of stress in your job. So we expect you to kind of build a brain that's better capable of dealing with that. So again, I realize I've kind of restated something I've said earlier there in terms of where the responsibility lies, but I wonder what you think of that. Like we get everything right at the organizations, then we have this expectation, you go away and build the right brain for you to thrive in this job yourself.
Yeah, so I guess the answer is I don't know what I think about that. I think that this is a stimulus response situation, so my hunch is change the stimulus. I don't know what the response is going to be, right? So until the organization sees what happens when they do create a more optimal environment, maybe behavior doesn't change, right? In which case we have to think about other things, but maybe it does. I mean, I think what we're ultimately saying here is, do we need an extrinsic motivator to get people to look after their well-being, or can we rely on intrinsic motivation? And I don't know if we know the answer to that. And more importantly, it's probably going to vary depending on the person, right? So some people are just going to be more naturally motivated to look after their well-being than others. I think where it becomes really difficult is, you know, making that clear link, like in order for an organization to put down those extrinsic motivators that, you know, you must do this, or there's going to be some punishment, or you're going to miss out on some reward, there really has to be a clear link that whatever it is they're demanding is fundamentally core to the work that this person is doing. Because providing that person can perform the work to the standard that the organization requires, then I don't think the organization can push beyond that. If there's a performance deficit and they can clearly link that to health and well-being, maybe a case could be made for more of a strict policy about that. I wanted to also come back to the stress thing. You know, I think the key word that you mentioned was chronic. And I think this is really important, and it's an area where we could learn a lot from how they design programs for athletes. So, you know, athletes are designed to perform in their sport, and for those key moments in their sport, it does deplete them, right? That's what they train for. They train for this big thing, and they have these big moments where the work that they do takes away from their body and it depletes them. They put everything on the line. They empty themselves. You see those marathon runners, you know, collapsing on the finish line, right? But those events are at certain times, right? So there's ebbs and flows. So their whole program is designed in a way where you have really low intensity periods, you have periods where you're building, and then you have these big events. And I think our work is a lot of people's work is like this as well. We have periods where it's really high intensity and we're going to give it our all, and it empties us. You know, that's a teaching semester for me. It's exhausting. It's longer hours, but I'm lucky I also get other periods where it's not as intense. So I wonder if there is a way, at least for some organizations and some jobs, where we can take advantage of those natural rhythms that the job has and, you know, help employees, give employees more opportunities in those periods of rest to recover properly, ask a little bit less, give them more flexibility over their time, knowing that when those high intensity periods come, they're going to be ready to go. And for a leader, that's great, right? That's what they thrive on. We need the challenge. Demonstrating competence is really important for intrinsic motivation. So, the challenge still has to be there. We can still work hard, but do we need to work at 100% of the time?
No, I'm totally with you. And I mean, this is actually where the whole workplace well-being thing gets really kind of vexing and puzzling. That there is still this kind of, I wouldn't say it's universal, but it's still a relatively widespread idea that intellectually people might know it to not be true, but in practice they certainly apply it. This idea that the more we just run people ragged, the more we're going to get out of them. That there is some, ultimate productivity gain to be derived from this approach of let's just, put the whip on people, see how much we can extract out of them, and at the end of the day, if the light bulb finally blows, we'll replace it as needed, kind of thing. And so in professional sports, we've known that's not a healthy approach. We've known that's not a healthy approach for a long time. However, and this is not a but this is kind of the obverse part here, being a professional athlete really does come with a lot of expectations around how you are going to manage yourself, right? So, you mentioned before this idea of, we have to clearly link some dip in performance, for example, to something that the person is not doing towards their physical or mental health. And that can be a very, very difficult thing to lock down, right? But let's say in sport, right? In professional sports, if you turn up to your job overweight or in some sort of like less than ideal physical shape, even if you perform well and it doesn't seem to be having any sort of appreciable impact on your performance, most professional sports teams are going to ask you to get your ass into shape. Still. They're still going to say, we've put you on this contract for a reason. So we get that, and we're amazed by the fact that we've got this athlete who's able to work around some of their less than ideal lifestyle related problems. And you may be able to work just as effectively in spite of those, but we're paying you money here, and we've got you on a contract. We can we have certain we hold other people in this organization to these standards as well. We expect that you're consistent with them. So I don't know that that's something like that, or that kind of mentality or that kind of philosophy is going to migrate neatly over to the corporate world, let's say. I suspect it really is, and I suspect that's going to be a very, very difficult sell. As you mentioned earlier, legal soup for one thing. Now, by the way, I don't agree with a lot of the laws governing this area as well. I think these laws have become a little too much in terms of what people are and are not allowed to use as proxy indicators of whether someone's an ideal fit for a job or not. But setting that aside, I get that this is going to be a much messier translation into the corporate world, but I don't think it needs to necessarily be that way either, right? I think professional sports doesn't have to be as narrow or unique a vocational context, off on its own compared to other domains of work in this respect. I think that, put it this way, let's just set up a kind of vignette here, right? So let's say that you've got someone who is eking out their work every day. They are meeting their KPIs, but at the end of every day, they're grumpy as hell, and they're not in a good mood, and it's rubbing off on their employees. Right, now let's say that person doesn't eat well, doesn't take care of themselves physically in any kind of structured or deliberative way. They don't get enough sleep. They drink too much. Let's just run the gamut of all the kinds of things they could be doing. At what point is it reasonable, or is it ever reasonable, for the organization to step in and say, hey, we know you're meeting your benchmarks, but you're a moody prick and it's rubbing off on people, and we know you're not taking care of yourself, so we expect more from you? Is there ever a point where the organization sort of morally, set aside again the legal tangle that you could find yourself in, but morally, should we not be at a world where, the owner of a professional sports club, you should just be able to say, hey, we expect more from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think how you go about a conversation like that becomes quite important. Like, the framing of we expect more from you is one way of doing it. This person is, rubbing off on their employees the wrong way and, creating disruptive emotions through the group. I'm assuming that somewhere in these KPIs there's something about relationships. So, having a conversation around, we've noticed that you don't seem particularly happy at the end of the day. You look really tired. You're doing great in all these other areas. How can we help? Is there a way we can help you? How about we set you up with a coach and see if they can figure that out with you? Because, we really want to keep you here, blah, blah, blah. Now, I think you can't assume it could just be the person hates their job, right? Like, they don't want to be there. It could be the health stuff. We don't really know. I think giving them a space to figure that out is important. And you can get to the same outcome of, improving their health and well-being. I think we know from all our research that just telling someone you must address X concern or what, like, it doesn't work. They don't do it. They don't change. So if the long-term goal is to keep people in the organization and to actually help them, I think taking a more developmental approach and giving them resources to figure out what it is that's going on. And actually, that's not different from the world of professional sport. If you've got a performance issue or something's going on, it's not like fix it. It's what's happening. Like, how come this is happening? How do we help you, fix that injury or whatever it is? And I think that's going to be an easier path to the same outcome. Turnover is expensive. You don't want people just leaving. And from what we know about how people change, it's not through being told what they should or ought to do with their health and well-being.
Sure, and totally. And the evidence is actually pretty clear on that front in terms of just the command and tell approach clearly doesn't work. It doesn't land with most people. So yeah, just telling someone you got to fix the problem, that's not going to work. Saying we're going to help you fix the problem, that seems to me moving in a much more profitable direction. But I think a more total conversation could be framed around something like, we're going to help you fix the problem, but you got to fix the problem. Right? So to say, we will give you everything that you need. We will set you up to do this. Okay, but you can't not do it. Okay, because I feel like that outcome, that to me is a real slippery slope. If the conversation stops at, we're going to help you, okay, that's going to be beneficial perhaps for the preponderance of people, right? But not universally. And my worry is that if we don't have that second part of the conversation, this idea that we're going to help you for a purpose, and that purpose is that there is something that needs to be solved here, and we expect you to play your part in that, then the conversation is incomplete, and ultimately it's not going to be an efficacious one.
Sure, absolutely. At the same time, you don't want to alienate the many who don't need the qualifier in order to get the small number of people who do need it on board. I would suggest try it without the qualifier, give it some time, see how it goes, and if it becomes evident that the more heavy-handed, we need to see something changing is necessary, then sure, I mean, maybe you get to that point. And who knows, right? Like, I don't think either of us really know how people would respond, but usually if an employer shows a genuine care and a genuine interest in trying to help you, I don't think people intentionally don't give it their best effort. I think people are really trying, and yeah, they don't succeed the first time. But I'm not sure that, again, laying down the hammer is going to lead to success the second time. So that's in a situation where they have a lot of control. There's also situations where there's something, it could be chronic pain that's causing the issue. It could be carpal tunnel syndrome, for instance, something that's related to the equipment that the person is working on. And definitely coming from a place of inquiry, of trying to understand what is the actual problem to begin with before we jump to an assumption. If you're coming from that place, people generally don't find that threatening or controlling or any of the above. It's just someone's trying to help you out. And I think that's probably going to be a better approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important here to sort of, for me to be clear, that I don't think there's as much daylight on this as we, between us, as we may have revealed in this conversation so far. I'm certainly not an advocate for the quote unquote laying the hammer down approach. And I agree. I totally agree that the qualifier that the complete version of that conversation is not one you have to have with everyone. I agree that the vast majority of people, if you set things up from the position of care and compassion and understanding and willing to put yourself in their shoes and just make the right provisions, then you don't need the kind of finger wagging follow up of but we have some expectations around you're actually going to do this. So I totally agree with all of that. I think that perhaps the problem we have right now in this discussion is that it's become too dichotomous, that basically, at the individual level and the organizational level, we either think that it has to be a throw the hammer down approach where the organizations just have to plant a flag and say, no, this is what our expectations are, and, go find a job somewhere else if you're not on board with those expectations, or, there's that side of things. The other side of that continuum, or the other side of that binary, I should say, is the too softly approach, the too accommodationist approach. And I think that side of things has driven a lot of my own concerns about this area. Just because, when I was living in the States, I went to quite a few conferences on this broader topic and, spoke with quite a few people who, their views on this were specifically geared around sparing people's feelings. Right? Now, sparing people's feelings and not causing undue emotional harm is, of course, important. Right? We don't want to be, again, cajoling people or guilting or shaming people or anything like that. But then there were some people who, for me, just took that mentality one step too far and made it seem like every time you have to administer a home truth to someone about, say, something like self-care and well-being, it has to be done in this way that I thought was, frankly, on some people's parts, infantilizing and too kid glove heavy. Those people for whom, those perhaps even vanishingly rare number of people for whom that qualifier I mentioned, those people for whom that qualifier might apply to. I've heard a number of people saying that you never apply the qualifier, you never bring it out, or if you do it, you do it in this way which is so mealy-mouthed and tepid and so designed conversationally to skirt around the issue that you're never going to make progress with such a person, and that harms them, right? Like to me, there is actually kind of there is an ethical abdication of care on the organization's part if they're going to apply and administer too much of a kid gloves approach to this issue. So maybe, you give me your thoughts on that, but do you think that binary that I've just suggested might be too much of the problem, that it's become too either or, and we just simply haven't found a way of integrating a good compromise middle ground on this front?
Look, binary thinking is always problematic. We don't live in a binary world, so yes, I definitely can't disagree with you. Am I allowed to show? Yeah. I had this on my reading list. This book just came out. It's called Both and Thinking.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, it's really tackling this. This is everywhere in our work life, right? We have these situations that can easily become binary, and talking about how do we get people to embrace the both and how do we navigate that, because it's not comfortable. It's sometimes quite uncomfortable with our emotions when we're in these spaces. So in terms of the both and, here's what I would say a both and response is to where we are right now. So my difficult conversations have to happen in organizations all the time, be it performance, be it self-care, whatever that is. And, my rule for unsolicited difficult feedback is always that, one, it has to be coming from a place of, I actually want to help this person. I'm not doing it with the intent to harm them. Second, I need to have a relationship with this person that gives me the right to be bringing up this conversation with them. And Now, you could say, like in a role relationship, you have the right because you have hierarchical power. I don't think difficult conversations, I don't think positional power is the way we want to go. I think we really want that actual personal relationship so that they know that you're coming from a place of care. Because when you're relying on your hierarchical power, it's questionable what your motives are. So, for leaders, this just means that you've got to do the work first, right? You've got to build the relationships. You've got to get your people to trust you. So when you need to have a difficult conversation, be it about self-care or some other hard feedback, that relationship is solid and people know that you're coming from the best of intentions in terms of where that feedback's coming from. So I think those conversations need to happen. They should happen. I also think they need to come from a place of care, and the relationship you have with that person is what's going to determine how they receive that conversation.
Yeah, and look, what you've just said there, this is where I feel like my knee-jerk intuitions about, I think I'm more on the individual responsibility sides of things. That this is where I have legitimate pause, right? Because I feel like on the chicken egg side of things here, this is where the chicken probably does have to be the organization, right? That right now, the paradigm is such, the operating principles is such that there just isn't enough compassion. There isn't enough care in organizations. There isn't enough of a dedicated, purposive belief in the well-being of the people that work for your company. There just isn't enough of that to set the right parameters in place by which individuals can go off and do things for themselves, right? This is where, I vacillate on this topic, as I mentioned before, my intuitions vacillate here, but this is one area where I really do feel like maybe the buck initially stops with the organizations. That maybe, okay, we almost just have to take a moratorium on how we even think about well-being and self-care in organizations first, and really just strip all the underlying assumptions bare, and then just reboot from this place of I really am invested at a genuine human level in you thriving as a human. And now you could go on to say part of my motivation for wanting to see you thrive as a human is as I also believe it will make you thrive as an employee more, and that's a worthwhile long-term conversation to have, right? But it doesn't have to be the initial conversation. The initial conversation can just be just at a human level, just pure compassion, pure care, purely being invested in you. I want to see you be at your best. And then from there, philosophically, maybe that's all we need. Maybe that kind of shift in perspective at a kind of grand level, at a widespread level, maybe that's enough to set the right kind of train in motion such that we do see more individuals willing to go off, knowing that they've got the company at their backs, to go and say, okay, yeah, I am actually going to start taking care of myself a little bit more. I am actually going to start playing my own part in this thing we call well-being. I'm not going to just leave it up to this organization that have shown me that they do genuinely care about me and that they are going to provide the support that I need. I'm going to damn well go and do things for myself as well. So yeah, that is probably, that view of things is probably where I am most sympathetic to the idea that the feedback loop here has to start on the part of the organizations. Sure,
and it could still include performance, right? It could still, if you've got a really good tight relationship with somebody, with the people you work with, you can say, look, I really care about you, and I've seen your well-being decline. I want to understand what's going on. It's starting to impact your performance, and I just don't want to see that happen. Let's figure out a way to change this, right? So it doesn't mean that you can't bring in the performance. I'm not convinced that bringing in the performance will necessarily add to the conversation, and it does run a risk. So, I think it's going to depend on the type of relationship you have and the type of manager that you are. If you're just not that caring manager, that's going to sound a little weird. They won't believe you. It's a both and. It's definitely not an either or. And I just also wanted to mention that I think some of my co-authors and I have been talking quite a lot about just the practicalities of how do you even approach this. And I think that we can look a little bit beyond the social psychology, organizational behavior, and out to the likes of design. I think design thinking, design science could have a really important role to play in how we go about incorporating well-being into the workplace. And, one really important principle of that movement is that the end user is involved in the design process. So you shouldn't be designing well-being programs if you haven't got people who you intend to use them involved in that process to help figure out what would actually be helpful, what is feasible for them, and what would be well received.
Yeah, I know. I think design's huge. I think, I actually speak about this. We both teach at business schools. The thing I always keep coming back to with my students is, when my undergraduate students talk about how you would design a workplace to be better for people's emotional health and well-being and stuff like that, of course they'll say things like the first place they go to is like, well, if I worked at Google, or Facebook or something like that, they go to the mega companies where it's like, let's just have a gym and a meditation room and like this like cafeteria that's like stocked with healthy snacks, and we'll have green space and everything will be super feng shui, and like the air will be perfectly conditioned and stuff like that. And then you kind of have to like wheel them back to pragmatic reality a little bit and sort of say, A, not every company's Google, and B, we're here in Vietnam, so things are even more limited than they would be in the West. But setting that aside, but even if you can't, even if you're not Google, even if you can't just like wave a magic wand and design all the cool stuff and provide all the cool resources that you could do in some, like extremely optimized company sense, there are still little policy and structural design changes you can make, regardless, even on the most shoestring budget. And that might even just come down to, It might come down to the way you design work days. It might come down to the way you design the interactions that people have between each other. It might be the way you design the jobs themselves. It could be, it doesn't have to be these like grandiose, dream company initiatives, right? Some of it can be just really basic elements of, resystemizing and redesigning and restructuring and so forth, regardless of your level of resources.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of these things don't cost a lot of money. Really simple things. What time are you sending emails to your employees? Doesn't cost more to send them, during working hours. Things like walking meetings doesn't cost anything at all, but it gets people up and out of their desk. We both work in business schools. All of my deadlines are 5 p.m. I don't do midnight deadlines because it becomes, when you have a midnight deadline, students stay up until midnight. They're not sleeping, and I don't want to encourage that. It could be looking at the menu in your cafeteria and swapping out some of those unhealthy things for some healthier options. Doesn't necessarily cost any more money, but it's a quick and easy change to make. And actually, interestingly, there is research showing that a lot of these perks that these big organizations have, where you pretty much have every possible thing that you want in your organization, actually leads to higher levels of burnout and decreased well-being, because people just never leave. They never leave their work. There's a really great piece by Alexandra Michelle. It's an ethnography of Wall Street bankers, and they had every perk available to them. They had laundry service, dry cleaning service. They never had a reason to leave their organization, leave their work, leave their desk. And so, again, the perks alone aren't enough. It's got to be a restructuring of how we actually work, and making little changes, right? Little nudges to help make it easy for people to do the right thing.
Yeah, for sure. And that's actually really interesting to hear about that. I'd not heard about that research, but that is super interesting. And it actually makes me think that on the restructuring side of things, this is where, I'm not a fan of the whole work-life dichotomy necessarily. I think the conceptual bright lines between work and life are maybe a little too bright. But one area where I think it's important to draw that kind of a distinction, it could be something like you've just mentioned, that, if you're going to offer employees perks and incentives to practice self-care and maximize their well-being, structurally, maybe you should make them off-site. You know, maybe it shouldn't be a case of, okay, sneaking in your 1 hour at the gym during that, like, vanishingly rare time, I should say, where you don't have a 12 o'clock meeting or something like that. It should be, okay, no, if you're going to go to the gym, finish work for the day, clock off, stop looking at your emails, go off-site, go to the gym, and then go home. So maybe it'd be interesting to see if they reran that research where the perks were all located off-site, as opposed to being all in-house. You know, I'm not sure if the data would cash out differently, but an open empirical question for smarter minds than I, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you know, even the off-site, on-site distinction is quickly going away for many people now. So we're all kind of facing this challenge of home is on site, right? And that just makes this whole thing a whole lot more complex, and I think even more challenging for some people. But it also provides a lot of opportunities for ways to enhance your well-being. So I think we'll definitely see a lot more research in that space, and a lot more changes as organizations figure out how do we operate in this new world where we have people at home, people on site, and a whole mix in between.
Yeah, I think it's actually going to be a really, really interesting future. I mean, this topic is certainly not going away. The major implications and you know, the serious consequential aspects to this topic are not going away. There's going to be, and I certainly hope there continues to be, a real urgency around this topic. And, you know, it's going to certainly take quite a bit of muddling on through from both organizations and individuals to figure things out. But all going well, you know, the research starts to make some of the current ambiguous areas a little bit more clear and apparent, and hopefully we start making some serious progress on this issue, because, you know, as you sort of alluded to at the top of the show, I mean, the statistics on this are not pretty, especially in the Western world. You know, it's actually getting to a point where, you know, there's not even an element of unseriousness where you can say with a straight face, this is killing people. This is actually killing people. You know, prior to COVID coming along, you know, the WHO famously called workplace stress the health epidemic of the 21st century. And that's not a caricature. That's not an over-exaggeration on any front. This is causing people to get unwell and ultimately, in some cases, to die. That, to me, however we figure things out, is an unacceptable status quo. And, you know, something has to be done about it. And I think organizations do, wherever the balance lies on how much of that responsibility they have, I guess remains a question that we'll continue to figure answers out for. But they do have some responsibility, and they need to start seizing the initiative and taking up the mantle of that responsibility, I would argue.
Absolutely. We're in agreement there.
All right. Well, that's probably as good a place as any to wrap things up now, Kylie. So it's been so cool to see you again, and so great to have you on the show. I really appreciate you jumping on, and this was fun. I mean, it was cool to just kind of riff on this organically and get your thoughts on it. You know, I'm pleased that you're actually involved in, you know, in research in this wider space, and so that you're going to be contributing towards, you know, a broader effort to enlighten us and enlighten organizations as to the best way to proceed. So all the very best with your research and the rest of your work, and hopefully we'll get to speak again very soon.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me. This was fun.
No worries. Thanks so much. Take care.